Excellency Mr. Ziad Abu Amr, in accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite Mr. Philippe Lazzarini, Commissioner General of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees in the Near East, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I also invite His Excellency Mr. Stavros Lambrinidis, Head of the Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. And I now give the floor to Mr. Philippe Lazzarini.
Mr. President, member of the Council, this is a time of seismic change in the Middle East. At the heart of this region, the United Nations Agency for Palestine Refugees, UNRWA, is a stabilizing force. In Gaza, the agency is the backbone of the humanitarian operation, coordinating and providing life-saving assistance. Beyond Gaza, it has championed human development for Palestinian refugees for decades across the region. Today, an insidious campaign to end UNRWA's operation is on the way, with serious implications for international peace and security. It is in this context that the Council is asked to consider the existential challenges confronting the agency. Mr. President, 6 months of relentless bombardment and a merciless siege have transformed Gaza beyond recognition. Homes, schools, and hospitals have been reduced to rubble, under which countless bodies lie. Children are bearing the brunt of this war. More than 17,000 are separated from their families, left to face the horror of Gaza alone. Children are killed, injured, and starved, deprived of any physical or psychological safety. Across Gaza, a man-made famine is tightening its grip. In the north, infant and young children have begun to die of malnutrition and dehydration. Across the border, food and clean water wait. But UNRWA is denied permission to deliver this aid and save lives. This outrage is occurring despite consecutive orders by the International Court of Justice to increase the flow of aid into Gaza, which can be done if there is sufficient political will. You have the power to make the difference. Member of the Council, UNRWA's mandate is supported by an overwhelmingly majority of member states. Yet, the agency is under enormous strain. It is facing a campaign to push it out of the occupied Palestinian territory. In Gaza, the government of Israel seeks to end UNRWA's activities. The agency's requests to deliver aid to the north are repeatedly denied. Our staff are barred from coordination meetings between Israel and humanitarian actors. Worse, UNRWA premises and staff have been targeted since the beginning of the war. 178 UNRWA personnel have been killed. More than 160 UNRWA premises, mostly used as shelters, have been damaged or destroyed, killing more than 400 people. Premises vacated by the agency have been used for military purposes by Israeli forces, Hamas, and other Palestinian armed groups. Our headquarters has been occupied militarily, and allegations have emerged concerning the existence of tunnels under our premises. UNRWA personnel detained by Israeli security forces have shared harrowing accounts of mistreatment and torture in detention. Mr. President, we demand an independent investigation and accountability for the blatant disregard for the protected status of humanitarian workers, operations, and facilities under international law. To do otherwise would set a dangerous precedent and compromise humanitarian work around the world. Member of the Council, the situation in the occupied West Bank is also highly concerning. Daily attacks by Israeli settlers, military incursion, and the destruction of homes and civilian infrastructure are part of a well-oiled system of segregation and oppression. UNRWA's operational space is shrinking, with arbitrary measures imposed by Israel to restrict the presence and the movement of staff. It is becoming increasingly difficult to keep our schools and health centers open and accessible. Legislative and administrative action to evict UNRWA from its headquarters in East Jerusalem and prohibit its activities on Israeli territory are also on the way. Mr. President, amid these challenges, serious allegations against individual UNRWA personnel in Gaza emerged in January. Horrified by this allegation, I immediately terminated the appointment of those concerned. The Secretary General ordered an investigation through the Office of Internal Oversight Services. In parallel, an independent review group is assessing how UNRWA upholds neutrality, a core principle guiding our work. Despite this prompt and decisive action, a significant amount of donors' funding remains suspended. This has serious operational implications and undermines the financial sustainability of the agency. Be assured that we remain firmly committed to implementing the recommendation of the review and to strengthening existing safeguards against neutrality breaches. Member of the Council, as I informed the General Assembly in March, calls for UNRWA's closure are not about adherence to humanitarian principles. These calls are about ending the refugee status of millions of Palestinians. They seek to change the long-standing political parameters for peace in the occupied Palestinian territory set by the resolution of the General Assembly and this Council. Accusations that UNRWA deliberately perpetuates refugee status are false and dishonest. The agency exists because a political solution does not. It exists in lieu of a state that can deliver critical public services. The international community has long attempted to contain, rather than resolve, the Israel-Palestine conflict. Lip service is paid to the two-state solution each time an escalation occurs, costing lives and hope. UNRWA was created 75 years ago as a temporary agency, a stopgap measure pending a political answer to the question of Palestine. If the international community truly commits to a political solution, UNRWA can retrieve its temporary nature by supporting a time-bound transition, delivering education, primary health care, and social support. It can do so until a Palestinian administration takes over these services, absorbing UNRWA's Palestinian personnel as civil servants. Mr. President, dismantling UNRWA will have lasting repercussions. In the short term, it will deepen the humanitarian crisis in Gaza and accelerate the onset of famine. In the longer term, it will jeopardize the transition from ceasefire to day after by depriving a traumatized population of essential services. It will make nearly impossible the formidable task of bringing 500,000 deeply distressed girls and boys back to learning. Failing to deliver on education will condemn an entire generation to despair, fueling anger, resentment, and endless cycles of violence. A political solution cannot succeed in such a scenario. Member of the Council, let me conclude with 3 appeals. First, I call on Council members to act in accordance with General Assembly Resolution 302 and safeguard UNRWA's critical role, both now and within the framework of the transition. UNRWA has long been a custodian of the rights of Palestinian refugees. It can only relinquish its central role of providing critical services and protecting human rights when a political solution is realized. Until then, the political support of member states must be matched by funding. Second, I urge you to commit to a genuine political process culminating in a solution that can bring peace to Palestinians and Israelis. This process must uphold Palestinian refugees' right and aspiration to a just and lasting political solution to their plight. Third, we must acknowledge that a political process alone will not guarantee a sustainable peace. The wounds that run deep in this region cannot be healed without cultivating empathy and rejecting dehumanization that is rampant, whether in political rhetoric or in the misuse of new technology in warfare. We must refuse to choose between empathizing with either Palestinian or Israelis, or showing compassion for either Gazan or Israeli hostages and their families. Instead, we must recognize and reflect in our words and action that Palestinian and Israelis share a long and profound experience of grief and loss, that they are equally deserving of a peaceful and secure future. I urge you to help realize this future through principled multilateral action and a genuine commitment to peace. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Lazzarini for his briefing. I will now make a statement in my capacity as Foreign Minister of Malta. I began by thanking UNRWA Commissioner General, Mr. Philippe Lazzarini, for his powerful briefing. Malta firmly reiterates that UNRWA is an indispensable lifeline for Palestine refugees in Gaza, the West Bank, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, and a stabilizing force in the region. Particularly amid the current catastrophic conditions in Gaza, Malta continues to be a regular contributor to the agency. Preserving the life-saving role and operations of UNRWA must be our primary objective. In Gaza today, we continue to witness the failure to uphold the laws of armed conflict. Personifying this is the staggering destruction and death of over 33,000 people in Gaza, the majority of whom are women and children. It is further manifested in the continued, onerous, arbitrary, and bureaucratic impediments preventing the necessary humanitarian scale up into and throughout the Gaza Strip. We are witnessing an entire population being brought to the brink of conflict-induced starvation, with credible reports that famine has already taken hold in the north. We are even seeing it in the lack of respect for the humanitarian notification and deconfliction system, despite the provisions of Resolution 2712. This is evident in the recent killing of the 7 World Central Kitchen workers, which occurred on the 1st of April, and the attack on an ambulance trying to reach 6-year-old Hind Rajab on the 29th of January, which resulted in more casualties. There are many more examples of this. Over 220 humanitarian aid workers, including over 100 UNRWA staff, have been killed since the beginning of this conflict. Many were killed providing urgent humanitarian assistance. Malta welcomed the UN's swift response to the establishment of 2 investigations to the deeply concerning allegations regarding the involvement of UNRWA staff in the terror attacks of 7th of October. We also welcome the commissioning of an independent review into the agency's adherence to the principle of neutrality. We note that the interim report of this review has indicated UNRWA has in place a significant number of mechanisms and procedures to ensure compliance with the humanitarian principle of neutrality. We now look forward to the outcome of both ongoing inquiries, including the Commission's final report due on the 20th of April, and call on all parties to fully cooperate with these inquiries. Regrettably, due to these allegations, several critical donors took the decision to suspend their funding to UNRWA at a time when the people of Gaza were in greatest need and stability in the region, for which UNRWA is a major contributor, is now threatened. We commend those who have continued or have since resumed their contributions. We appeal to others to resume the desperately needed funding and ensure that the agency has the necessary resources to operate. It is in this vein that Malta recently issued a further financial contribution. In these difficult times, we need to avoid politicizing the work of humanitarian actors and undermining the work and legitimacy of the United Nations and humanitarian actors in Gaza. It is also important to ensure that accountability for any violations of international law, including international humanitarian law, is ensured. It is our responsibility to protect those, such as UNRWA staff, who risk their lives to help and protect others. I thank you. And I now resume my function as President of the Council. I give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Ahmed Attaf, Minister for Foreign Affairs and National Community Abroad of Algeria.
شكرا السيد الرئيس. لا أجد خير ما أستهل به كلمتي هاته من الترحم بكل خشوع وإجلال وإكبار على أرواح 178 عونا من أعوان وكالة الأونروا الذين ارتقوا شهداء الإنسانية نتيجة الجرائم الإسرائيلية المتواصلة على غزة، وهم يمدون أيادي الإغاثة لأهلنا الفلسطينيين وسط الحرب المسلطة عليهم ظلما وجورا وغصبا. كما أود أن نتوجه إليكم سيادة المفوض العام فيليب لازاريني لأحيي فيكم شخصيا وفي كافة العاملين تحت وصايتكم روح التفاني وروح الإخلاص وروح التضحية، وبالخصوص نكران الذات بل هبة الذات، وهي خصال جعلتم منها ردائف راقية لاسم منظمتكم. فلكم منا كل الدعم والثناء والتقدير لأنكم تمثلون آخر.
We want to express to you our deep appreciation for your efforts, because we see in it one of the last glimmers of hope. Now, this hope is being diminished, and yet the Palestinian people is clinging on to this hope throughout the tragedy it's living through. You embody the ideals and the values on which this organization, this House of Humanity and Civilization, is built on. A house which never lets the cries of the oppressed fall on deaf ears, nor the cries of suffering. Nor to the cries and wailing of our brothers who have fallen in Gaza. Furthermore, you are the best, most authentic witnesses of the modern Nakba, which the Palestinians are currently going through, following the great historical Nakba. You carry high the flag of international commitment to the Palestinian people. You are the foremost expression of solidarity, as you have taken up the just cause of the Palestinians. 75 years have gone by since UNRWA was established. UNRWA is as old as the Palestinian cause itself. Over these decades, the agency has exhibited its extreme importance and its central role in supporting Palestine refugees so as to lighten the burden of their displacement. Without any true solution to their cause on the horizon. Today, as things stand, this UN agency is being subjected to flagrant attacks. It's being targeted in a shameful way. It's being targeted by the expansionist occupation power, Israel. Israel did not hesitate in bombing of 160 UNRWA facilities. It spilled the blood of UNRWA staff and employees. It used fallacious pretexts, any excuse possible, to reduce the agency's funding and to put an end to its very existence. There can be no doubt about it. The international community is now fully cognizant of the intentions of the occupying power, as well as of the objectives which it hopes to achieve through this policy. A policy which is at odds with the international solidarity that is UNRWA's mandate. And we saw this at the General Assembly just a few months ago. UNRWA is indeed being targeted because it reflects the very characteristics of Palestine refugees. These refugees have their own agency, an agency which meets their needs, in contrast to all other refugees the world over. UNRWA is also being targeted because it is inextricably linked to Resolution 194, as well as other resolutions which enshrined the rights of the Palestinian people to return home, to go back home to their territory, to go back to their homeland. Third, the third reason that UNRWA is being targeted is because this is a key component of Israel's plot to liquidate the Palestinian cause, to strip the Palestinian national project of its very content. This is a pillar of the Palestinian state. Confronted with the situation, the international community must exhibit courage. It must protect UNRWA and facilitate its vital activities, helping millions of Palestinian refugees, and the Palestinian diaspora. This is a stance which should guarantee the legal status of UNRWA by hampering Israeli attempts to transfer UNRWA's functions to other bodies. And this comes on top of the need to establish mechanisms which could guarantee sufficient funding, long-term sufficient funding for the agency's activities by including them in the organization's regular budget. Algeria welcomes the growing number of international community members who have decided to reverse their decision to suspend funding to UNRWA. My country calls on other states to follow suit, to take the same level-headed stance, because this is a way of responding to the cries for help we're hearing from thousands, in fact millions of Palestinians who have been compelled to flee. They were displaced. They've been stripped of their most basic rights, their right to have a roof over their heads. They've been deprived of the very minimal conditions of life and livelihoods. His Excellency, the President of the Republic, Mr. Al-Jid have proclaimed that there will be an exceptional financial contribution, $15 million. This money will go to UNRWA. This is an exceptional, an extraordinary contribution which will go on top, which will come on top of Algeria's other contributions, which have been provided directly to the Palestinian Authority. We believe that we are truly duty-bound, that we have a responsibility to honor this pledge. And the same can be said for other members of the international community. We are unswervingly convinced that UNRWA must continue its work as long as there are Palestine refugees. And in fact, the return of Palestine refugees is an inalienable right, which cannot be denied. It cannot be preempted. Furthermore, the Palestinian cause is indivisible. It is comprehensive. It cannot be dismembered and nor divided. We are similarly convinced that Israel's expansionist occupation cannot continue in defiance of the entire international community. Because the two-state solution cannot be held hostage by the dithering, by the manipulation that the occupying power is engaged in. The international community cannot be taken prisoner by the occupying power's miscalculations, its disillusionment. This cannot go on indefinitely. The international community must make its voice heard.
I'll give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Tsukasa Umura, Special Envoy of the Middle East of Japan.
Thank you. I would like to pay tribute to the initiative of Jordan in proposing this meeting. I also thank Mr. Philippe Lazzarini, Commissioner General of UNRWA, for his briefing. Mr. President, more than 6 months have passed since the terror attacks by Hamas and others, and the subsequent outbreak of fighting in Gaza. The humanitarian situation on the ground is literally a serious crisis. According to reports from international organizations, about half of Gaza's population, or about 1.1 million people, are expected to enter the most severe stage of famine. They are suffering from shortages of even minimum essential goods for human life, such as safe water, food, shelter, medicine, and necessities for women and children in poorest sanitary conditions. Human dignity, to which Japan attaches great importance, is under threat. There is a growing risk of destabilization in neighboring countries that host Palestine refugees. In response, the Security Council under Japan's presidency adopted the resolution 2728 on March 25. Mr. President, needless to say, UNRWA has been playing an extremely important role in providing humanitarian assistance to Gazans facing such a devastating humanitarian crisis and has made many sacrifices. Regarding allegations that UNRWA staff members were involved in the terror attack on Israel on October 7 last year, Japan appreciates the progress being made to strengthen UNRWA's governance under the leadership of Secretary General Guterres. Japan highly welcomes the interim report, which has been submitted to the Secretary General by the Independence Review Group led by Madame Colonna, and the action plan, which has been formulated by UNRWA Commissioner General Philippe Lazzarini. Japan lifted its suspension of funding to UNRWA on April 2nd and has already completed a disbursement of approximately 35 million US dollars. In the Gaza Strip, we will provide assistance to women and children to improve sanitary conditions. We will also provide such support as medical services for Palestine refugees in the West Bank, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. Mr. President, the Independence Review Group is currently working toward developing its final report and recommendations to be presented on April 20. In consideration of the final report, Japan will continue to support UNRWA's reform efforts in cooperation with other donors. As a part of our support, Japan will contribute to the development and implementation of training to strengthen the neutrality of frontline management staff, which is one of the action items of UNRWA. Mr. President, since October 7 last year, Japan has launched a series of humanitarian assistance contributions to the Palestinian people, the scale of which exceeds 100 million US dollars. Japan is calling for the release of hostages and compliance with international humanitarian law, and making a series of diplomatic efforts, taking into account what can be a realistic approach to improve the humanitarian situation, including a ceasefire. I thank you very much.
His Excellency Mr. Yamura for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Madam President, we'd like to thank the Commissioner General of the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East, Mr. Philippe Lazzarini. Thank you for your report about the situation in the occupied Palestinian territories, OPT, in the context of the activities of the UN body he heads up. His assessments are most worrisome. The Council should have discussed them long ago. For the 7th month, we're seeing an unprecedented humanitarian catastrophe unfolding in the Gaza Strip. Everyone knows about the facts, the unthinkable statistics, the number of people dead, and those in need of urgent food and medical assistance, as well as reported cases of people dying of famine and dehydration, including minors. Despite the demands of the UN Security Council pursuant to Resolution 2728 and in violation of international humanitarian law, in the enclave, we're seeing an escalation of military hostilities. In the last 24 hours alone, it has claimed the lives of 68 people. Under these conditions, the delivery of humanitarian assistance to the people of Gaza is practically impossible. UN agencies are saying in unison that humanitarian access to the enclave is practically non-existent. According to OCHA, the IDF is blocking half of humanitarian convoys heading to the Strip. Yet, according to aid agencies, there is aid. Supplies are waiting at the border. There are financial resources for organizing the deliveries. They're sufficient. It all comes down to opening the checkpoints and ensure the security of the convoys. We've warned time and time again that in the absence of lasting sustainable ceasefire, which must be duly monitored by military observers, all of our humanitarian efforts are doomed. Colleagues, humanitarian workers are defenseless in the face of an army which has weapons. No voluntary deconflicting can be of help if one of the parties is intent on continuing military hostilities, especially when one of the Security Council members is sending messages that Security Council resolutions are supposedly non-binding. Against this backdrop, the role of UNRWA in the OBT is indispensable. We call on you to pay tribute to the heroism of agency staff. They are implementing their humanitarian mandate under inhumane conditions. They are paying with their lives. So far, 178 staff have perished. This is the highest number of staff of a UN agency that have died all at once. Against this backdrop, what's categorically unacceptable are attempts to label UNRWA a terrorist organization, as well as calls to close it down, which we've also witnessed here in this very chamber. Unfounded allegations leveled at UNRWA staff shouldn't be used to tarnish this entire organization, which is large, it's highly important. It has 13,000 staff working in Gaza alone. If UNRWA can no longer work, this will become yet another legal and a moral tool for indirect collective punishment being meted out on millions of Palestinians in dire need of aid. Since the conflict escalated in the area of the Palestine-Israeli, since the escalation in the Palestine-Israeli zone, roughly 2 million Palestinians have been forced to leave their homes. Yet the largest portion of IDPs found refuge in UNRWA facilities, which, despite their status, are still being subjected to Israeli bombing. As recently as the 12th of April, a primary school in the Nuseirat refugee camp, which actually enjoys UNRWA patronage, was bombed. 1 person died, 9 were injured. This demonstrates that there's a deliberate attack on years of efforts, on advances made by humanitarian aid workers who are protecting the civilian population. In parallel, the Western Jerusalem authorities are circumscribing the agency's activities in the Gaza Strip. Since the 24th of March, humanitarian access to the northern governorates of the Strip has been blocked. The situation is most dire there. Movement of UNRWA staff in the West Bank is also restricted. Agency's banking operations have been made more difficult, as have customs and visa operations. Against this backdrop, we are outraged. We cannot understand the decision taken by a number of key donors to suspend funding to UNRWA, owing to allegations that were leveled at its staff, allegations of cooperating with Hamas. And this despite the fact that Western Jerusalem still hasn't presented any evidence to incriminate the 12 staff it has named. We categorically condemn attempts to discredit the agency through disinformation campaigns. We believe that UNRWA funding should be restored in full before the investigation is finalized, and the investigation must, in fact, be objective, based not only on information provided by Israel, but also information from the Palestinians. There is no alternative to UNRWA. It is the channel for providing assistance to Palestinians both in the OPT and also in neighboring Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria. And this until we find a fair settlement of their status within the framework of the settlement of the Palestinian issue. Clearly, against the backdrop of the broader regional turbulence we're seeing, the needs of Palestinian refugees are only going to get bigger. Thus, a number of countries should take upon themselves additional financial duties, and we commend this. We call on other states to support UNRWA on a depoliticized basis so as to ensure that it can conduct its work uninterrupted on a sustainable basis. On our side, we'll continue assisting UNRWA in all sorts of ways, including through our annual voluntary contributions to the agency. After all, its activities are of humanitarian import, but they also have a political dimension. They have an important stabilizing effect on the entire Middle Eastern region. Madam President, the only way to stop the catastrophe in Gaza from spreading is an immediate ceasefire across the board, ensuring safe and unhindered humanitarian access to all Gazans in need of assistance. This is also necessary to prevent the threat of the crisis broadening. UN Security Council Resolution 2728 seems to be not enough. That's clear. It's simply not being implemented. Ramadan is over. The issue of a lasting ceasefire remains very acute. We take as our starting point that the UN Security Council will revert to the consideration of this issue very shortly. Once again, I'd like to remind you, not implementing binding UN Security Council resolutions should result in sanctions being imposed on those violating these resolutions. And we believe that the Council needs to consider this issue as a matter of urgency. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Gracias.
Thank you, Madam President. I should like to begin by thanking UNRWA Commissioner General Lazzarini for the briefing he's just provided. Ecuador values his efforts and reiterates our constant support for his work. Madam President, last January, worrisome reports were published of accusations that various UNRWA staff members had participated in the terrorist attacks of the 7th of October, attacks which Ecuador condemns once again. In this regard, my country hopes that the investigation underway will allow the facts to be established as soon as possible, and that those individually responsible are brought to justice for anything that they are determined responsible to have perpetrated. For this to happen, all parties must cooperate with the Office of Internal Oversight Services of the United Nations and provide all relevant information in a timely manner. In addition, on the 20th of March, it was announced that the independent group appointed by the Secretary General to review UNRWA's work had observed that this agency has underway a significant number of mechanisms and procedures to guarantee compliance with the humanitarian principle of neutrality, and also that it has identified various critical areas which still need to be addressed. The final report of the independent group, which will be circulated in just a few days' time, must be carefully analysed, and its recommendations will be extremely important. Madam President, colleagues, 178 UNRWA staff members have died as a result of the war. And Mr. Lazzarini, I reiterate my country's condolences to their families. UNRWA's work is vitally important to alleviate the situation of the civilian population in Gaza and in other areas of the Middle East. A possible suspension of UNRWA's activities would, without a doubt, also affect the work entrusted to the senior coordinator, Sigrid Kaag, and the implementation of this Council's resolutions. Therefore, to conclude, I reiterate my call upon all those who are able to contribute to financing the agency's operations, since their continuation is a factor for stability in the whole region. Thank you very much.
Representative of Ecuador for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you, Commissioner General Lazzarini, for your briefing. The United States mourns that at least 178 UNRWA staff have been killed in this conflict. We mourn the loss of dedicated humanitarians and valued colleagues. This conflict has been one of the worst in recent memory in terms of the number of aid workers who have been killed. More than 240 humanitarian workers have been killed since October 7 in Gaza, many while on duty. Even more have been injured. These incidents are unacceptable. Humanitarian personnel must be protected, full stop. We are deeply concerned. Israel has not done enough to protect humanitarian aid workers or civilians. For that reason, the resolution the United States introduced last month in this council demanded, and I quote, all parties to the conflict fully respect humanitarian notification and deconfliction mechanisms and remediate any deficiencies, unquote. Although Russia and China vetoed that resolution, we repeat that call today. As President Biden conveyed to Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu on April 4, Israel must, quote, implement a series of specific, concrete, and measurable steps to address civilian harm, humanitarian suffering, and the safety of aid workers, unquote. U.S. policy with respect to Gaza will be determined by Israel's immediate and sustained action on these steps. As this council knows, the United States paused additional funding to UNRWA as a result of the serious allegations regarding UNRWA personnel allegedly participating in the horrific October 7 attacks. The U.S. Congress has since prohibited additional contributions until at least March 2025. We urge UNRWA and the wider UN system to take all steps necessary to strengthen the neutrality of the organization and improve UNRWA's sustainability. At the same time, we recognize UNRWA's indispensable role in distributing humanitarian assistance and maintaining continuity of care in Gaza, and we urge UNRWA's continued humanitarian access in Gaza and the lifting of all on its work. The United States is gravely concerned about the dire food insecurity and the very real risk of imminent famine. UNRWA is critical to averting this. Of course, as our Jordanian and other colleagues from the region can confirm, UNRWA also plays a crucial role throughout the region in contributing to the stability of the region and supporting Palestinian refugees. From educating hundreds of thousands of students to providing primary health care and critical relief and social services, UNRWA is the bedrock of support for the most vulnerable Palestinian refugees in Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and the West Bank. The United States supports this important work and emphasizes that it must continue uninterrupted. The United States has long advocated for reforms of UNRWA and emphasized the need to strengthen UNRWA's management and oversight. The final report of the Independent Review Group on UNRWA, commissioned by the Secretary General, and the results of the OIOS investigation will be important to guiding reform efforts. We welcome UNRWA's statement that the Review Group report will be the authoritative report for future action. For further accountability, we urge the Secretary General to provide a full and transparent plan for how he will follow up on this report. As we have conveyed, we expect the report to have clear and strong recommendations to guide UNRWA's work going forward and prevent the prospect of staff supporting terrorism. We have been impressed with the interim work reviews and appreciate the complexity of the issues presented. We look forward to the review group's final recommendations. The United States will continue working with UNRWA, other donors, and hosts to implement reforms for UNRWA to remain operational as long as it is needed. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you very much, Madam President. We want to thank Jordan for requesting this meeting on the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian refugees in the Near East. And we want to thank Commissioner General for his briefing. We recall UNRWA is a lifeline for generations of Palestine refugees in Gaza, the West Bank, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. It is an agency reflecting the historical responsibility of the collective membership of the UN. UNRWA is part of the social fabric of these areas of operations. It is a factor of stability. UNRWA's work is mandated by the UN General Assembly as a promise of a just solution of the Palestinian refugee question. It needs to be respected. Today, we are discussing the critical work of drivers, social workers, nurses, teachers, sanitation workers, engineers, doctors, and other life-saving assistance providers. UNRWA staff members are the unsung heroes of the war in Gaza. This Council has held numerous discussions on the conflict in Gaza, marked by the dire human toll of the conflict, the threat of imminent famine, and a near collapse of basic services. UNRWA's work was evident at each and every one of these meetings, from providing shelters to internally displaced persons to delivering food and other essential goods. In the Council's discussions, their work is portrayed in a variety of ways. However, there is a general agreement that UNRWA has become indispensable because of its resources, experiences, and knowledge. NGOs working in Gaza have made it clear that they are unable to substitute for or absorb the role of UNRWA. Secretary General, UN agencies, and the UN coordinators dealing with Gaza crisis have also been clear. UNRWA is the backbone of the humanitarian response in Gaza. We take seriously the allegations against UNRWA employees brought forward in January. While they are concerning, we welcome the swift reaction from both the Secretary General and the Commissioner General. An OIOS investigation into these allegations was established. We're also looking beyond on how to further strengthen the agency's neutrality and transparency, and we are looking forward to the final report of the independent review of UNRWA. Slovenia has stood by UNRWA and consequently by the civilians that it serves. We have maintained our financial and political support throughout this crisis. We will continue to do so. We welcome the fact that a number of donors have reversed their decisions and resumed their financial support to the agency. We urge other donors to revoke their suspension of funding. And we call on new donors, small and large, to come forward. It is simply about the survival of the largest provider of aid in Gaza. It is about the survival of civilians in Gaza. We are concerned over the continued obstacles to UNRWA's work in Gaza and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. UNRWA convoys are denied from entering Gaza and accessing the north of Gaza. UNRWA faces eviction from its headquarters in Jerusalem. These are some of very concrete concrete examples. Among others, these actions must be reversed.